for a model of the media in which the media argue for and defend the established institutions of society. And any deviation from that defense is dismissed or even suppressed, so that views that dissent from the overwhelming consensus that characterizes our society cannot get a hearing. Now, here you are tonight in a large lecture hall at Canada's most prestigious journalism school, speaking to an audience of journalists who are hearing your remarks with apparent approbation. Your remarks are being broadcast on the government-owned radio network as part of the most prestigious lecture series on that network. How'd that happen?
Recall that what I said was that this is a very good first approximation to the description of a complex social institution. Now, you remember that I mentioned, I'm afraid this remark may sound a little insulting, but let me try to say it without sounding that way. I specifically mentioned that in the United States, for example, if I wasn't talking about, say, listener-supported radio in a small community. In fact, as you get away from the elite centers that matter, things open up. Okay. Now, the fact of the matter is that Canada is a much more open society in this respect than the United States, and the reason is it's less important. This generalizes. I can talk this way in Belgium, in Israel, in Latin America. I can't talk. I can talk this way in the United States, but not on national radio and television because it's just too important. What people think about international affairs in Canada just doesn't matter that much to established power. If it did matter that much, Canada would close up too.
If CBC then is just a small, a publicly funded station in some small town, looked upon in that perspective, why don't we turn to the CBC person on stage here, and Margaret Daly, perhaps you can have a turn.
Well, I was intrigued by the thesis and particularly impressed by the volume of sort of factual documentation put forth to prove it. Not all of, as you said, that you were about to read off to us, because that doesn't make good lecture. But I look forward to reading this stuff in a long version. I guess the question that I want to ask, though, is that given that this information isn't discussed, you lay it all out, supposing people knew it. And obviously individuals do know it. Minorities, intellectuals, foreign affairs buffs, if you want to call them that. Those kinds of people can assemble all this information. Then what? It doesn't seem to make any difference, and why is that?
Well, I think it does make a difference. I think it makes a lot of difference. I mentioned, not entirely jocularly, that if a third world country today were to put forth the American Constitution, we'd call it a reversion to Nazism. And I mentioned that that's a sign of hope and progress. There has been moral progress over 200 years. There's also been progress over 20 years, 30 years, my active lifetime. Again, I'm talking mostly about the United States. I wouldn't talk about Canada. I just don't know enough about Canada. What I know is the United States. But it's a different country than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Now, elites are not different. They're pretty much as indoctrinated as they always were. Elite group, contrary to a lot of necessary illusion, elite groups, including liberal intellectual elites, did not oppose the Vietnam War. They supported the Vietnam War, supported it enthusiastically. They began to turn against it somewhat after Wall Street turned against it, and more or less for the same reasons, because it was too costly. The media were almost totally closed to critics of the war. But among the general population, this crisis of democracy did take place, and it changed the society. I think it led to probably, I hope, a permanent cultural change outside the elite centers. And the United States is just a different country than it was 20 years ago in a lot of respects. Everything from interpersonal relations to attitudes relations between men and women, to treatment of ethnic minorities, to concern over international affairs, and so on. You can see, and the reason is because outside of while the major institutions of indoctrination continue on their natural course, other modes of interaction did develop. And they remained, they're informal, they're inefficient. They may, I mean, I spend probably 80%, I don't know, some huge percent of my time traveling around the country giving talks. Well, you know, that's less efficient than writing for a major journal, but people do this, and ultimately it makes a difference. There are solidarity groups, there are all kind of organizations and so on, and they do make a difference. You can see it. So take, for example, I mentioned the U.S. attack against South Vietnam in the early 1960s. You compare the early 1960s with the 1980s. That's 20 years. When Ronald Reagan came into office, his administration, in my view, intended to emulate John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, except their target was Central America. They came out with a white paper in February 1981, right after they came into office, which was kind of like modeled on the white papers of the 1980s, virtually a declaration of war. The communists are taking over the world, we've got to go in there and stop them. It was a precursor to direct U.S. military intervention in Central America. Now what happened? What happened, and the media, incidentally, bought the whole story. There was virtually no criticism of the white paper when it came out, just enthusiastic support for it. However, the general population didn't, because the population is not what it was in the early 60s. When John F. Kennedy started sending the American Air Force to bomb South Vietnam on a regular basis, there was no protest. You couldn't get two people together in a living room to talk about it. And it didn't have to be hidden either. It was on the front page of the newspapers. Nobody cared. We want to bomb another country? Great. You know, let's go to the next thing. When Ronald Reagan's administration sort of indicated that they might try to turn to direct military intervention, there was a convulsion in the country. People started coming out of the woodworks. It ranged from a massive flow of letters to Washington, to demonstrations, to church groups getting involved. A whole array of protests began to develop spontaneously without any organization and structure. The reason is the country is just a lot different. Well, what happened? What happened is that the Reagan administration backed off. They, in fact, told the media to cool the rhetoric, to cut back the inflammatory rhetoric. They were afraid that much more central themes of their program would be endangered. After all, remember that they were trying to ram through a program that the population was strongly opposed to, a domestic economic program. They were trying to ram through destruction of the limited welfare measures that exist in the United States, a huge transfer of resources from the poor to the rich, a massive increase in state power, and huge public subsidy to high technology industry through the Pentagon system and so on. All of these things are contrary to what the public wanted, and they didn't want any protest about them. So what they did was back off from their inflammatory proclamations about Central America, and they went underground. That's what the Iran-Contra hearings were about. The administration was driven underground. The domestic population would not tolerate the activities that they wanted to carry out, and they therefore had to turn to illegal clandestine activities. Now, the Reagan administration was notorious for the level of its clandestine activities. And clandestine activities are a pretty good measure of popular dissidence. If there isn't any popular dissidence, you don't have to carry out clandestine activities. You can carry out overt international terrorism and violence, which is much more efficient. Overt violence is much more efficient than clandestine violence for obvious reasons. I mean, for one thing, it's just more efficient to do. For another thing, there isn't any risk that it'll be exposed, which will cause, you know, a scandal and so on and so forth. And in fact, the state was driven underground by popular dissidents. Well, that's important. You know, those are, I think that's one of the many reflections of the difference between the 1960s and the 1980s. I think and in fact, even the media are different. Bad as they are, I mean, as you can see, I'm no great enthusiast for the elite media, but they're better than they were 20 years ago. I mean, they're not as closed and restricted and constrained as they were 20 years ago. And that includes the elite media. So there are slow changes. And I think there is a slow move towards general democratization, much too slow, but not insignificant. And those are things that, first of all, one can be somewhat hopeful about, but it also teaches you a lesson. It means there are things you can do. After all, these are societies. Our societies, like Canada and the United States, have one tremendous virtue. The state is very restricted in its capacity to use force against citizens. By comparative, it's not zero, but by comparative standards, it's low. And that means there's a great range of options available. People want to make use of them, and many do, and it makes a difference.
There's never been anything clandestine about the career of Peter Worthington, so maybe we'll go to Peter next.
Well, like Margaret Daly, I'm very impressed with the massive evidence that's been arrayed. Unfortunately, it isn't all accurate, and a lot of it's very selective. But I'd like to return to David's thesis. It strikes me that your living refutation of the thesis that you can't get a certain point of view across. You've hardly been a shrinking violet over the past 30 years, but it seems to me the effect of your theme has been virtually zilch, except for a few of the elite who support it. It seems to me the great mass of the American people, the workers, either don't understand it or reject it totally. Which brings me to the point, what's the difference between being free and democratic and thinking you're free and democratic?
I'm not sure I
You see the
understand the
difference?
last point. No.
Well, you can be free.
Like
For
I can
example,
be free?
Well, people can. For
People can,
example,
yeah.
perhaps we don't think the Soviet people are free and democratic. They may think they're free and democratic, and it seems to me the result is the same thing, being free and thinking you're free.
I don't think so at all. First of all, I don't agree with your factual assumption. I think it's exactly the opposite of the truth.
What factual?
Well, what you said is that you said correctly that I haven't been a shrinking violet, and you said the effect has been zilch except for elements of the elite. The facts are exactly the opposite. The effects on the elite are zero, and the effects on the general population are not insignificant. Not just me, I'm one person. There are a lot of people doing this sort of thing, and we have much greater outreach than we've ever had before, not through the elite media. I mean, when as I said before, I travel around the country all the time. I can't accept a fraction of the invitations that come. I'm booked up solidly 2 years in advance, and I probably don't accept maybe 10% of the invitations that come in.
The thesis works well for you.
But see, there's a reason for that. That was not true 20 years ago. When I got started in this, I was talking to people. If I could talk to 3 neighbors in a living room, I'd consider it a good evening. You know, I was giving talks on the Boston Common where we had to be protected by the police to prevent us from being murdered. And that was going on until 1966, you know. And Boston is a liberal city, incidentally, and this was with the support of the media.
But the media wasn't ignoring you.
Oh, totally. I mean,
how
look,
come all of the
in the
accounts go back?
1960s, well, I mean, see, there are a lot of illusions about this. In the 1960s, the media were completely closed to anybody like me. That includes public radio, for example. The most liberal segment of the American media is probably National Public Radio in Boston, where I live, and I'm not unknown. During the entire Vietnam War, when I was very well known for opposition to the war, I was on National Public Radio once for, I think, 5 minutes, if I remember, after I came back from Vietnam with an extremely hostile interview by the most liberal commentator, Louis M. Lyons. That was it. Now, I could never be in the newspapers or anything of that sort. By the early 70s, it began to change a little. And by the late 70s, it changed more, and in the 1980s, it's considerably more. I mean, it's still very limited, but if I wanted to, I could probably at this point, say, write op-eds for quality local press, not the New York Times, but say the Minneapolis Star-Tribune or something. That was unimaginable in the 60s.
Yeah, but that's the elite, surely.
It's not. No, you see, but that's a reflection of, see, I think that's missing the point. The elites are about as closed as they always were. But the general population has changed, and that's beginning to affect the institutions. I mean, outreach to the general population is much easier than before. No, I mean, I gave my own experience, but other people do the same, have the same experience. You talk to much wider groups, much bigger audiences. They're much more sophisticated. I mean, in the peak of the peace movement, I was always cutting corners. I would never say what I thought. I never talked about the U.S. attack against South Vietnam in the 1960s, even in student activist groups, because they wouldn't know what I'm talking about. Nowadays, I never talked about institutions. I never criticized. Today I talked a little about capitalist democracy. I'd never talk about that kind of thing. In the 60s, it was just too exotic, you know. But now the things that I don't cut any corners anymore anywhere. I can be giving a talk in eastern Kentucky or, central Iowa or something else, and I say exactly what I think, and people generally understand it. They may not agree, they may be surprised, but they want to listen and they want to think about it. Those are changes outside of the elite circles.
And they all go and vote Reagan, and now look like they're going to vote Bush.
See, but I think that's a misunderstanding. Let's take a close look at the electoral system. First, let's take Reagan, for example. Ronald Reagan is called a very popular president by the elites, but the fact is quite different. Ronald Reagan's popularity, the United States is a very heavily polled society. The reason is that business likes to keep its finger on the public pulse. If you're trying to control the public mind, and that's one of your main commitments, you want to know what people are thinking. So there's very extensive public opinion surveys, and you can learn a lot from them. You have to be cautious, but you can learn a lot from them. Well, let's take Ronald Reagan. Turns out that his popularity is roughly the norm for presidents. It goes along, the president's popularity is usually very closely predicted by, the popularity of the president is predicted rather well, within a few percentage points usually, by people's perception of what's happening to the economy. If they sense that the economy is improving, they say they like the president. If they sense that the economy is going down, they say they don't like the president. The reason is that people generally treat the president as being something like the flag, nothing that they have anything to do with, just some symbol of authority up there. Most people understand that they're marginalized and out of the system. And Reagan's popularity has gone along pretty well that way. Furthermore, you take a look at the so-called landslide victories of Reagan. Let's say take 1984, what's called a landslide victory. Reagan won about 30% of the electorate. That's called a disaster in most industrial countries.
It's rather more than FDR got.
No, it's not. The voting percentage was much higher at that period, and it's been declining ever since. Been declining regularly since the 1890s with slight fluctuations, and it's still going down. It's now about a little over 50% for presidential elections, and the last congressional elections was about 37%, I think. This is a regular process of decline. Furthermore, more interestingly, if you look at the exit polls in the 1984 elections, that is, the polls that were taken of voters, not of non-voters, you find that by about 3-2, they opposed Reagan's policies. That is, when people were asked, do you hope that Reagan's legislative program will be enacted? By about 3-2, people said no. If you looked at, that means that people were voting against interest. Now, what does that mean? Are they crazy? No. There are other results that explain what it means. The Gallup poll asks every year, polls the general population on the question, who do you think runs the government? And you get a series of options. The answer, the government is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves, gets a little over 50%. Okay? And we could go on, but put all this together, and here's what you have, I think. Here's the picture you have. Apart from elites, whose job it is to be indoctrinated, they're, after all, the purveyors of propaganda and its main targets. You get away from elite circles, which are usually the most indoctrinated circles, and get to the general population, what you have is a lot of skepticism, a sense that this system has nothing to do with me. Somebody else is running it. Most people, if you participate, it's a formality. And when you participate, it's just a patriotic gesture. The Reagan phenomenon is very interesting in this respect. I think it gives a kind of a foretaste to where capitalist democracy is going. The United States is more advanced. We're ahead in the game. Others will get there too. Most of the population, I think, regarded Reagan as a symbol. You vote for Reagan the same way you say, I feel good about the country, or I like the flag, or something like this. It's as if you were voting for the Queen of England. I mean, the Queen of England may open Parliament by reading a speech, but nobody cares whether she believes it, or whether she even understands. Unions have virtually been destroyed in the United States, sometimes by violence. We have a very violent labor history, but largely by other means. The unions were largely depoliticized for a long time. Now they're really disappearing. I think it's now about 17% of the workforce or something like that. That's a success of U.S. democracy. There are no political parties in the United States. You don't participate in a political party. You can push a button, but that's very different than participating in forming programs. In fact, the United States is basically a one-party state. It has the business party, the Tories, with two factions, supported by different segments of the business community, shifting segments of the business community. Let's go back to the 1984 elections, and notice what the population was asked to vote on. The Republicans were the party of Keynesian growth. They were the party of deficit financing, huge state subsidy to industry, huge debts, in the hope that somehow things would be taken care of. So the Republicans were saying, follow us, we'll have growth at the cost of huge debt. Later generations will worry about it. The Democrats were the party of fiscal conservatism. They were saying, look, you got to worry about the consequences. You can't just, make checks and have a powerful state that's interfering in the economy and so on and so forth. Now, the population was given a choice between damn the consequences, a jingoist Keynesian growth, and we believe, we accept, we really agree with you, but we're afraid of the consequences, fiscal conservatism. So they voted for the thing that made them feel more upbeat. Notice, incidentally, that the two parties shifted their traditional positions. Well, that was easy because the parties don't stand for anything anyway. They just reflect different sectors of the business community. The Democrats reflected interests of investment bankers and people who cared about money and so on. And, the population ended up voting for the people who made them feel better.
And the people like it.
No, they don't like it. They in fact, that's where you're wrong. I don't think people like being outside the system. That 50% of the population that says the system's run by a few big interests looking out for themselves is not happy about it. They just don't see any alternative. They've been atomized. Their organizations have been broken up. A working class culture has been dissolved. It used to exist. You have to go back to the 1930s. At that time, there was a live working class culture with its own organizations, institutions, everything from newspapers to picnics. It took a long time to break that down. In other countries, which are not as advanced as the United States, it was broken down later. Let's say take England. It's a very interesting case. England is a generation or two behind the United States in this process. In England, they still have a Labour Party, though they won't for long. In England, up until the 1960s, they had a very lively Labour-based press, which created which was very large. The Daily Herald had much more readership than the famous newspapers, the Times, the Guardian, and so on. And it had extensive participation on the part of its readers. It couldn't survive conditions of the market. I mean, the market is designed so that dissidents are excluded naturally. It couldn't get advertising and so on and so forth. So it disappeared by the 60s, and so did the rest of the social democratic press. And with it went the cultural basis for an alternative vision of the way society ought to be organized. And gradually, participation in that dissident culture also dissolved. The Labour Party will go the same way, and other industrial democracies, capitalist democracies, will also go the same way. That's somehow inherent in the process. The United States is simply more advanced. On the other hand, there are counterforces. So while the classical organizations and institutions have dissolved, others are developing. In fact, that's what the crisis of democracy was all about. People do find ways to get together. The United States is very interesting in this respect. You'll take a look at U.S. politics, real politics. I don't mean the stuff the Democrats and the Republicans, things that actually, involve people in action that could affect policy, like solidarity work and so on, or ecological issues or whatever. You'll notice that overwhelmingly they come out of the churches in the United States. That's very unusual in industrial societies. The church, it happens, there are places where it happens. It happens in East Germany and in Poland, because they're depoliticized societies too, just like the United States is. Now, in these depoliticized societies where the party structure has disappeared and independent organizations have disappeared, typically what is left is the religious institutions. And since people want some way to associate themselves, they go to them. So in places like Poland and the United States, or East Germany, say, when there's a disarmament movement, it comes out of the church, because there is nothing else. And the United States is not unlike that. I mean, the structures are different, the methods are different, and so on, but you see some of the same phenomena coming out for the same reason. And I think what it shows is that people want to be free and don't like the fact that they have no way to do it.
I should have known better than to give the ball to Peter before I got around to we got around the whole table. I'll ask now Gene Allen, foreign editor of the Globe, to pose his question or comment.
Yeah, I'd just like to make partly a comment and partly a question. And it relates to how some of the things you describe are experienced by somebody who works in the news on a day-to-day basis from a Canadian perspective. Many of the things you describe about how the elite press in the United States sees the world are replayed to us through some of the main communications links that we rely on, such as Associated Press, Reuters News Agency, New York Times News Service. And I think many Canadian journalists are in the position of recognizing a strong U.S. bias in those reports, and are active in. That's one of the day-to-day challenges, is trying to find ways of getting around that. One of the things you can do is get your own correspondents there who have a different point of view, or try and get local stringers. You can't do that all the time. But I just wonder from that, from my point of view anyway, it seems that perhaps a lot of what you describe could be simply interpreted as kind of the American press playing cheerleader for the home team. It's just like there's a kind of sports writer who's called a homer, and the home team can do no wrong. And perhaps can you look at it that way, just as an issue of American foreign policy, and countries like Canada can have some effective room to maneuver in terms of covering the world?
Well, I think there's something to that, but we have to be careful about what's the home team. I mean, for example, what the American press defends is the interests of elite elements in the United States. Now, it may be that the general population is strongly opposed to elite elements, but they're not the home team. It's the elite elements that are the home team for the reasons that I mentioned. So on, say, Central America, there's no doubt that the general population has been pretty much opposed to these policies, but the home team is in favor of them, and the press is in favor of them. Let's take Vietnam, the Vietnam War. There, that was very interesting. At first, the general population was strongly in support of the war, strongly in support. I mean, I'm not kidding when I said that when you tried to give a public talk, you might end up getting killed. But it changed. By about 1969, the population was largely opposed to the war, and on interesting grounds. The population was opposed in principle. Again, you take a look at the Gallup polls. Up until today, or at least 2 years ago, which was the last one I saw, about 70% of the population regularly says the Vietnam War was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. Now, among opinion leaders, it's not 70%, it's like 40%. Opinion leaders includes clergy and businessmen and so on. When you get to the real intellectual elite, the percentage is about zero. Even at the peak of opposition to the war, like around 1970, the real intellectual elite, as picked by various standards, was of course opposed to the war. So was everybody, including Wall Street, but because it was just not paying anymore. But they were opposed on pragmatic grounds. It wasn't working, it was too costly, it was maybe too bloody, and so on. But fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake, that position is barely expressed in the ideological system, but it's the position of about 70% of the population. Now, here we have a striking case where, the home team that you're working for is not the general population. It's a very specific interest in the general population. I think that's true in a lot of issues. Let's turn to a totally different question. Take nuclear test ban. Just through popular grassroots organization, the population was about 75% in favor of a nuclear test ban 2 or 3 years ago. Elites were strongly opposed to it, liberal, conservative, everyone else. They were so strongly opposed to it that when the Soviet Union declared a unilateral test ban, the media barely covered it. I mean, they noticed it and disparaged it and told various lies about it. And when it was renewed, it was barely even covered. And it was hardly even an issue in the elections, even though 75% of the population was in favor of it, had virtually no elite support except maybe an occasional gesture. That's a very strong elite position, but it's not reflecting the general public. That is so strong, and so let me just give you an example of how strong the elite concern over this is. Here's a dramatic case. Last November and December, you remember there was a summit in Washington at which the INF Treaty was signed. All attention was focused on the summit and disarmament and treaties and so on and so forth. Everybody was paying attention to it. Right at that point, the UN General Assembly had a disarmament session in New York, a couple of blocks from the New York Times offices. They passed a whole raft of resolutions, very interesting ones. There was a resolution against Star Wars, against militarization of outer space. Don't hold me on the numbers. I'm reporting from memory, but it was something like this. I think the vote was about 154 to 1 in favor of against militarization of outer space. There was a vote on creation of new weapons of mass destruction. The vote was something like 135 to 1. There was a comprehensive test ban vote. It was about 140 to 2. The one, of course, was the United States. This time France came along. There was some other similar issue. The votes were like 140 to 3. On some of them, England came along with France and the United States. Mainly, the United States was in isolation against the entire world on these issues. Well, these were never even reported in the New York Times. Literally not reported, or the Washington Post, as far as I know, or anywhere. I never saw them anywhere. Maybe if you looked at some local newspaper, you could find them. I don't read every newspaper in the country, but certainly the general population was not allowed to know about these things. And the reason is that these things happen to accord with the interests of much of the population. Even without any elite support or institutional support, much of the population is opposed to the mainstream policies. This shows up even on domestic issues. For example, let's go back to the Reagan landslide. Throughout the 1980s, there have been extensive polls on the Reagan policies, and the population has opposed them strongly. When the population is asked, would you prefer spending on the military or on medical care, by large proportions, depending on how the question is asked, proportions like 4 to 1 or 7 to 1, the population is in favor of social programs. When people are asked, would you accept higher taxes if they were going to be used for X, Y, and Z, the answer comes out yes if X, Y, and Z are things like education, environment, welfare, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, the elites, in a bipartisan consensus, were tearing apart what limited welfare state there was. And the media were saying, well, it's because the population is getting conservative. They weren't. In fact, there's been a kind of a slow drift towards New Deal-style attitudes over the years with little fluctuations, and that's not the home team that the press is rooting for. They have other interests. So I think there's something to what you say, but I think one has to be more discriminating about how to define the home team. The home team means the people who own the country and therefore ought to govern it.
Or the official home team.
Yeah.
The last person on the panel who has yet to speak is Kevin McMahon, and maybe at this juncture I'd encourage the other members of the panel to jump in and as they see fit, and perhaps we can engage each other and in a discussion at this stage. Kevin, why don't you?
Just to pick up on the last point, I don't think that we ought to be too pious about the Canadian media versus the American media, because I think that most of the things that you're talking about generally operate in Canada as well as in the United States, and in a peculiar sense. CBC Radio, even though it is the national broadcasting medium, is in a way a marginal media outlet. But I wanted to go back to something you spoke about earlier, which is the depoliticization of the population. It seems to me that you would encounter most of the criticism of your ideas from the kind of middle management level within the media, and by that I mean editors, working journalists, and so on, because I presume that the people who own media corporations are well aware of what they're up to, and I think it's my impression that most of the population feels that it's being propagandized, and I mean, it's an old idea. It goes back to, the front page and so on, the whole business that, it's them, it's all one big thing, that the newspapers are owned by the companies and so on. And from that comes two things. I guess one question deals with the level of responsibility that these ideas place on working journalists. And perhaps you might make some comments about that. And the other side of it is how much you feel that the public's my impression is that because the people feel generally propagandized, they turn more and more towards using media as strictly a source of entertainment. You know, it's a postman idea about it doesn't really matter what they say because they say it so stupidly that that you know people are just consuming it for a laugh. And I wonder if now that doesn't become more of a problem really than propaganda. I mean, despite the really impressive evidence that you amass, I don't think you know, most people would be convinced by a couple of sentences saying we're propagandized. And so, yeah, I wonder if entertainment isn't really the greater problem now.
Yeah, I mean, remember that what I've been talking about gives a, I think what you said is very important. What I've been talking about gives a kind of a skewed picture. I maybe should have emphasized more, but remember, I'm talking about the elite media. The elite media, and the elite media target largely educated people. They target the political class, the more or less politically active class, a pretty small percentage of the population, the articulate elite intellectuals. And that's the kind of propaganda I've been talking about, and that's only a small part of the system. Things have to be done for the rest of the population, too. They have to be marginalized, but they're not going to be marginalized by telling them lies about foreign policy, because just as you say, they don't believe most of what they read. There's just a kind of a general populist skepticism, along with this sense that the government is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves, is the sense that the media are probably lying to us. So for most of the population, the media system is, I think, a different one. It's one that it's not just the case that it tries to entertain them. It tries to entertain them through means which will intensify attitudes that support the interests of elites. So you want, for example, let me give some cases. Take the emphasis on professional sports. Now, it sounds harmless, but it really isn't. I don't think professional sports are harmless at all. Professional sports are a way of building up jingoist fanaticism. You're supposed to cheer for your own team. Just to mention something from personal experience, I remember very well myself when I was, I guess, a high school student, sudden revelation, you know, when I asked myself, why am I cheering for my high school football team? I don't know anybody on it. If I met anybody on it, we'd probably hate each other. You know, why do I care whether they win or if some guy a couple blocks away wins? Well, you know, and then you could say the same thing about, you know, the baseball team or whatever else it is. This idea of cheering for your home team, which you mentioned before, that's a way of building into people irrational submissiveness to power, you know, and it's a very dangerous thing, and I think that's one of the reasons it's such a big, it gets such a huge play. Let's move to something else. Part of the in the 1970s, there was great concern among elites about this crisis of democracy. Now, I talked about one aspect of it, how to rebuild the propaganda, the indoctrination system, but there were other aspects. There was a lot of concern that young people were just getting too involved, that their human feelings were becoming too significant. Now, remember, there's something very significant about capitalism. It has to eliminate human feelings. Capitalism is based on the idea that really the only human value is greed. You know, everything else is irrelevant. Now, the capitalist system has not been able to achieve 100% success. It hasn't gotten to the point where, let's say, inside a family, people the children try to steal food from one another or something like that. There's still other human emotions that still exist. But the structure of the system is to make greed the only serious emotion, and everything else has got to be subsidiary to it. Notions like solidarity and community and concern and all these things that people feel. Of a me generation, you know, everybody's out for themselves. You know, everyone wants to be a yuppie. Nobody cares about anyone else, and so on and so forth. Where did that come from? You know, what was the evidence that that was a fact? I think the evidence was zero. In fact, I don't think it was a fact at all. I'll bet you that that was invented in advertising offices and such places, and it was targeted against young people. The targets in that case were teenagers. Teenagers had to be indoctrinated by saying, you people are only interested in yourselves. You live in a culture of narcissism. You're the me generation. You're not like these guys who used to worry about other people. Now, every single teenager knows perfectly well that's not true of me. But you're targeting people who are at a delicate stage of life. They don't quite know who they are. They're searching for their identity. They don't like to be different. They're worried if they're different. If they're different, they feel maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm weird. I better be like everyone else. And I think what happened is that there was a major effort made to try to get young people to suppress their natural feelings and to try to emphasize the self-centeredness which would eliminate the danger of serious engagement in issues that concern all of us, which is a threat to power and privilege. Now, I can't prove that. I'm just because we don't have documents on how these things are created. But I don't see any evidence that in the 1970s it was any more a me generation than ever before. In fact, I think the evidence shows the opposite. The 1970s was the period when some of the most significant popular movements developed. The 1970s was the period when the feminist movement developed. It was very scattered. It was just beginnings of it in the 1960s. Of all the things that came out of this period, that's probably the one that has had the most far-reaching and lasting effects on the general culture, and that's largely a movement of the 70s. Same is true of the environmental movement, 70s, the nuclear movements and so on. In fact, there's just no evidence for any of this stuff, but this was drilled into people's heads, and that's part of the popular culture too. Sitcoms and entertainment are another example of it. They're not just keeping people entertained; they're getting them entertained on particular assumptions.
We could move from your discussion of this dismissal to your discussion of the thing dismissed.
Yeah.
You say that what the media do is to ignore certain kinds of atrocities that are committed by us and our friends, and to play up enormously atrocities that are committed by them and our enemies. And you posit, in fact, you say in the Massey lectures that there's a test of integrity and moral honesty, which is to have a kind of equality of treatment of corpses.
Equality of principles.
I mean, that every dead person should be in principle equal to every other dead person.
That's not what I say at all.
Well, I'm glad that's not what you say, because in fact, that's not what you do.
Of course it's not what I do, nor would I say it.
That's right.
In fact, I say the opposite. What I say is that we should be responsible for our own actions primarily. That's something quite different.
But it isn't. But
Polish with 100 priests.
I wasn't equating them. I was comparing the treatment of them. If you want my value judgment, we should give much more attention to one priest who we've killed than to 100 priests that they've killed. Notice that this is exactly
isn't your method.
That's exactly my method.
Because your method is to ignore, is not so much not only to ignore the corpses created by them, but also to ignore corpses that are created by neither side, but which are irrelevant to your ideological
That's
agenda.
totally untrue.
Well, let me give you an example.
Okay.
One of your own causes that you take very seriously is the cause of the Palestinians, and a Palestinian corpse weighs very heavily on your conscience, and yet a Kurdish corpse does not.
That's not true at all. I've been involved in Kurdish support groups for years. That's absolutely true. That's absolutely false. I mean, just ask the people who are involved in, they come to me, I sign their petitions and so on and so forth. In fact, if you look at the things we've written, let's take a look. I'm not Amnesty International. I can't do everything. I'm a single person. But if you read, say, take a look, say, at the book that Edward Herman and I wrote on this topic. We wrote a book about this in 1979. In it, we discuss three kinds of atrocities, not two, three kinds of bloodbaths. What we called benign bloodbaths, which nobody cares about, constructive bloodbaths, which are the ones we like, and nefarious bloodbaths, which are the ones that the bad guys do. Constructive bloodbaths are things like the Indonesian massacres, which we supported. Nefarious bloodbaths are like Pol Pot. But we also discussed ones that nobody cares about, like Burundi. For example, we have probably the only discussion in the literature, I guess, of the massacres that were going on in Burundi at that time. We probably have the only discussion in the literature, at least that I know of the massacres that are going on in Burma. Now, in fact, not only is what you say not true, but it's the opposite of the truth. We went out of our way to find the kinds of bloodbaths that are just ignored because nobody cares about them. Now, again, let me stress, I'm not Amnesty International. I do not have I don't have the ludicrous egotism which makes me the arbiter of all atrocities over the world, right? I'm not trying to give an A to this country and a B minus to this country and so on. The principle that I think we ought to follow is not the one that you stated. It's the principle that we rightly expect Soviet dissidents to follow. Okay, what principle do we expect Sakharov to follow, let's say? What lets us decide whether Sakharov's a moral person? I think he is. Sakharov does not treat every corpse does not treat every atrocity as identical. He has nothing to say about American atrocities. And when he's asked, he says, I don't know anything about them, I don't care about them. What he talks about is Soviet atrocities, and that's right, because those are the ones that he's responsible for. Just as in, it's a very simple ethical point. You're responsible for the predictable consequences of your actions. You're not responsible for the predictable consequences of somebody else's actions. Now, we understand this when we're talking about dissidents in the Soviet Union, okay? But we refuse to understand it when we're talking about ourselves for very good reasons. Commissars in the Soviet Union don't understand it about dissidents. Commissars in the Soviet Union attack Sakharov and other dissidents because they don't talk about American crimes, right? We understand exactly why that's just hypocrisy and cynicism when they do it, and we should understand the same when we do it. Now, the fact of the matter is that I spend a fair amount of effort on crimes of official enemies. There are a fair number of people in the United States and Canada from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe who are there because of my personal activities on their behalf. But I don't take any pride in that particularly. I just do it because I'm interested in it. The most important thing for me and for you is to think about the consequences of your actions. What can you affect? Those are the ones you primarily ought to be concerned about. Of course, every corpse is a corpse, but there's some that you can affect and there are others you can't do much about. You know, like I can be worried about things that happened in the 18th century, but I can't do much about them.
Could I bring the topic back to, I'm just worried that we're going to end up getting into a long discussion about American foreign policy and where we all stand on it. It seems to me that what you've been saying that's interesting and maybe a little bit new is, the responsibility and the involvement of the media in this policy and in selling it. And I found the tenor of your talk rather bleak and fatalistic, and the tenor of your answers to the questions rather more hopeful. You talk about the things being better than they were 20 years ago, and how you could now turn up on an op-ed page in a quality local press like the Minneapolis Star-Trib. But with all due respect, that's not a substantive change, because everything I've ever read says that maybe 3% of the readership ever looks at those pages, and in most of those cases it's for the cartoon. Now, you make the distinction, but you're talking about elite media versus, quote, popular media. I'm not so sure you can, that seems to me to be an awfully artificial distinction for somebody in your position to make. Not so much that I believe that the editorials of the New York Times do have a huge direct effect on the masses, and I think you're probably right that they are brighter than that. But, television does, and not through overt editorial or news coverage. Now, I guess what I want to hear more from you on is, to what extent is that a more serious form of indoctrination, and because it's a more subtle one? Yeah. And what's to be done about that?
Yeah, I think maybe I haven't been clear, so let me try to see if I can say it more clearly. When I was saying that I can write an op-ed in a local quality newspaper, that was not my criterion for what's better about the country. Somebody raised the question of, are the media more open, and my answer was marginally. But what's better about the country is what's happened out in the sticks. That's what's better about the country. What's better about the country is that there's enough popular opposition to state terror and violence so that the government was driven underground. That's what's better about the country. What's better about the country is that things like feminist issues, ecological issues, solidarity work, and so on, things that just weren't on people's agenda 30 years ago, now are on many people's agenda. That's better about the country. The fact that some of the local quality press will occasionally allow an op-ed is just a pale reflection of this. That's not the important thing, so let me make that clear.
Is it a pale reflection, or is it an indication that they're more irrelevant than they used to be, like what you said about Canada?
I don't agree. I think, it's partly that. That's why I mentioned Minneapolis and not New York or Boston.
Surely the Vietnam War was the turning point in terms of where public opinion was formed, in which media.
All these things, Canada matters a lot too. A lot. It's an important country. It's not the United States, but it's a very important country. And it's not, everything or nothing. I mean, we're all at some, level of ability to exert influence. And what happens out in Iowa is very important. I'm very happy that the church groups have changed. They're not supporting violence and atrocities the way they once were. They're now, to a large extent, opposing them, and that's important. They reflect what's happening among a large part of the population. Now, however, your point about the effect of TV and so on attitudes, that's extremely important. I think we're beginning to get to that before. I just made a couple of comments on it, but let me go on. The indoctrination that's done by TV and so on is not trying to pile up evidence and give arguments and so on. It's trying to inculcate attitudes. I mentioned a couple of cases, but there are a lot more. Let's take, say, the bombing of Libya. Why did the American public support the bombing of Libya? Well, the reason is that there had been a very effective and careful and intense inculcation of racist attitudes about Arabs. I mean, anti-Arab racism is the one officially is the one form of racism in the United States that's considered legitimate. I mean, plenty of people are racists, but you don't like to admit it. On the other hand, with regard to anti-Arab racism, you admit it openly. I mean, you read a journal like, say, The New Republic, and what the kinds of things that they say about Arabs, if anybody said them about Jews, you'd think you're reading Der Stürmer. I'm not joking, and nobody notices it. Because Arab anti-racism is so profound. It shows up in literature. I mean, there are novels that have a form of anti-Arab racism that's hair-raising. Same is true of television shows and so on and so forth. An image has been created throughout a lot of the media are part of this, not all, of the Arab terrorist lurking out there ready to kill us. And against that background, you could bomb Libya and people would cheer. Recall how effective that was. Remember what was happening in 1986. There are a lot of measures of how effective this is. Remember that in 1986, when this happened, the tourism industry in Europe was virtually wiped out because Americans were afraid to go to Europe, where incidentally, objectively, they would be about 100 times as safe as in any American city. That's no joke. But they were afraid to go to Europe because they got these Arab terrorists out there trying to kill us, Now, that was not from New York Times editorials. That was from a whole array of television and novels and soap operas and, massive symbolism and so on and so forth, and that's effective. I mean, that's the anti-communist hysteria is developed that way, too. The communists are out there ready to kill us. Who are the communists? I don't know, they're out there ready to kill us, This is introduced by the kinds of symbolism that TV is good at and cheap novels are good at and so on, and that's important. These are critical means of indoctrination. It's just that I wasn't talking about them. I was talking about the more intellectual side, which is easier for me to deal with. But I don't mean to suggest that the part that I was talking about is the only important part or even the most important part. I mean, I think these things are tremendously important. I just haven't got a lot to say about them.
The CBC, in its blurb about you coming here, called you a self-proclaimed anarchist. Is that an accurate description?
Sure.
And we were all sitting around here discussing with an anarchist.
Yeah, I've said it over and over.
I haven't heard a hell of a lot I've agreed with, but fortunately my credentials as being once an employee with the Daily Herald, and when it went out of business, my social democrat views are now integrated into the establishment media, fortunately perhaps. Your talk of the Vietnam War, the turning against it, and you said for moral grounds because it was an immoral war.
On the general population, not the elites.
My view would be that the public turned against it, regardless of the point that I think it was a mistake, but I think the public turned against it primarily because it was a losing war. And can you give me any indication of a winning war that's been unpopular?
Well, can I give any indication of a winning war that's unpopular? See, quite honestly, I think the Vietnam War was a winning war from the United States for the United States.
It didn't look like a winning war from where we were.
Well, but that's indoctrination.
We're propagandizing.
That's indoctrination.
Oh, yeah, I see.
See, in order to decide, let's be careful.
That's fine.
Let's be careful. To decide whether a war is a winning war or not, you have to figure out first why it was fought, right? That's what tells you whether it was a winning war or not.
There's a variety of ways to tell it's
That's
winning.
right. There are a lot of ways but one of the ways, if you're logical, is to ask what were the goals of the war and were those goals achieved. That's the way you decide whether a war is a winning war, right? If we do that, we're not going to do this in 1 second, but let me again just talk methodologically, because there's no time to go through the whole story. You can look up the documents. There's elaborate documentation on the background planning for the Vietnam War, elaborate documentation on the high-level planning. And the main concern all along was that independent nationalism in Vietnam might be what was called a rotten apple that would infect the barrel. It might have a demonstration effect throughout the region, very much like Nicaragua. And there's a way you deal with that. The way you deal with a virus that might infect the region, the virus in this case being independent nationalism, the way you deal with it is by destroying the virus and inoculating the region from the spread. Now that was done. The Vietnam War had a dual character. You had to destroy the possibility of independent development in Vietnam, and you had to create around brutal military dictatorships which would prevent the spread. And both of those things were done reasonably effectively. Part of the Vietnam War was the support for the Indonesian massacres in 1965, a very significant part. Part of the concern over Vietnam was that it would encourage the growth of independent politics in Indonesia, where you had a huge mass-based, peasant-based communist party, and success in Vietnam might have spurred that on. In 1965, that party was wiped out with the slaughter of maybe 700,000 people to enthusiastic support in the West, I should say. That was part of the inoculation of the region. Same happened in Thailand, same happened in the Philippines with the Marcos coup, all around the region. Meanwhile, Vietnam was sufficiently destroyed, so the chances of it being a model for anyone else are very slight. I mean, Vietnam will probably barely survives. You know, it's suffered the kind of fate that there's nothing to compare with in European history back to the Black Plague. You know, be a century before they even recover, if then. So that's a partial victory. Wow. It's in terms. So here you didn't have a total victory. They didn't get their ultimate goal. You know, if you call success only achievement of every goal, even the minor ones, then it wasn't a victory. But if we give an accurate assessment, it was a partial victory. Partial defeat, partial victory. They didn't reabsorb Indochina back into the American system, but they prevented it from being the threat of a good example. In this respect, the American war in Nicaragua is also